Hey, Cliff Goldstein here, and welcome to the program. You know, over the years, I'm a writer, so I read. I'm so glad they got ebooks now because I wouldn't be able to fit them in my house. Now I got them all on my iPhone and my iPad. And I got my hands on a series of books called A Very Short Introduction to, and then it was ever the topic was. And that's what they were, very short introductions to all sorts of topics. And I don't know how many words they were, but they were just these teeny little books. If you sat down, you could probably polish it off in an hour or so. And they were put out by Oxford University Press, and there are hundreds of titles, and there's more and more and more, you know, titles like A Very Short Introduction to Ancient Egypt, to Darwin, to Animal Rights, to Epidemiology, to Fascism, to Film, to Thomas Aquinas, to Racism, and so forth. They're kind of an intellectual, a dummy's guide to whatever. And anyway, I've got on my desk, I've got at home maybe 10 of these on my shelf. And books like Short Introduction to Atheism, Short Introduction to Kant, Short Introduction to Wittgenstein. You know, I like this philosophical mumbo-jumbo. And anyway, I guess, too, maybe one of the reasons they do it is that the internet is giving everybody a very short attention span. And so maybe they thought, we'll give these books for people with short attention spans. Anyway, I have one of the books that I saw that I had to get. It was called A Very Short Introduction to the Meaning of Life. The Meaning of Life, a very short introduction. Man, how could that have not caught my attention? Now, the author is this guy. He's a hoot. His name is Terry Eagleton. He's a British college professor, teaches English, and he's a Marxist of all things. Yeah, they still got a few around, maybe more than we wish. Anyway, I happened over the years to have read some of Terry Eagleton, and he is great. He is witty. He's a pretty deep-thinking writer. I mean, he doesn't fit the typical dogmatic mold that these people fall into. And he doesn't seem to be afraid to tackle anything. I read a book of his a few years ago in which Eagleton, as a Marxist, he's certainly no Christian believer, but he railed against the hard-nosed dogmatic atheism of Richard Dawkins and the late Christopher Hitchens. In fact, he called them both, playing on their names, Ditchkins. He called them. And I said, he's a very funny, witty writer, and I have enjoyed reading Terry Eagleton, regardless of how much I disagree with an awful lot of what he says. But anyway, the topic he wrote, A Short Introduction to the Meaning of Life. Libraries are filled with volumes and volumes on this topic, and he's going to cover it in a little booklet that you can maybe read in an hour. Again, how could a topic like this, if you've been watching my show at all, how could a topic like this not catch my interest? Anyway, here in the preface, in a very typical Terry Eagleton fashion, he writes, quote, anyone rash enough to write a book with a title like this had better brace themselves for mailbag filled with letters in erratic handwriting enclosing complex symbolic diagrams. The meaning of life is a fit subject either for the crazed or the comic, and I hope I have fallen more into the latter camp than the former. Okay? And in the preface, too, he ends it with this. Now, this is cute. I can at least claim to have written one of the very few meaning of life books which does not recount the story of Bertrand Russell and the taxi driver. And in case you don't know the story, this is a famous story of one of the most profound intellectual figures in the last century, and probably my favorite atheist writer, and lived in the 20th century. His name was Bertrand Russell. And according to the story goes, Russell's an old man. He gets into a cab, and the taxi driver looks, I guess he would look over. What side are they on? Oh, yeah, they're on the left. He looks over, and he sees his famous passenger, and he says, "So, Sir Russell, what's it all about? I mean, what's the life about, meaning of life?" And supposedly Russell said, "I have no idea, I have no clue," and off they went. Anyway, Eagleton starts out by asking the question of self, asking the question here. He goes, what is the meaning of life, he says, is a pseudo-question. Like, what is the meaning of a cloud? Or what is the meaning of a potato? Okay? The point is, he's asking, do these things in and of themselves have meaning, or is the idea of them having a meaning only something that we as humans bring only because we are asking the question? Okay? Now, this is kind of a subtle argument, and it gets to the heart of some really deep, basic philosophical things that, I don't want to get into that now, but only it's gotten into the question of language. This is the idea that all philosophical problems are really just questions about language, and that any philosophical problems we have are merely problems of language and our grammar. Now, he touches on this, but he moves on, and I'm glad, because I think that whole project to make all philosophical questions just questions about language is a cheap way out of trying to get out of what are some difficult issues. We discuss these issues with our language, and our language, has limits and weaknesses and so forth, and that's fine. But, in one sense, if you go to McDonald's and you ask for a cheeseburger and then they give you a cheeseburger, what more do you want language to do? I mean, we exist, we live, we think, we suffer, we die. These are real issues, bringing in a host of philosophical problems, okay? And to just say they're just language problems is like saying, well, if I just talk differently about death, it won't be a problem anymore. Or we need a better grammar when we talk about death, and then it won't be so bad, and on, blah, blah, blah. It's all sorts of silliness, I think. But anyway, Eagleton is smart enough to know there's more than that, which is why he just brings up the question of language, but doesn't dwell much on it. Anyway, now this is very, very interesting in the book. He gets into really what I think is the foundational question, the foundational issue in something as broad as the question, what is the meaning of life? And that, interestingly enough, he brings this up too. He goes back to the question, yes, dear listener, he goes back to the question of creation. He goes back to creation. He asks early on in the book this famous question, and I've talked about this before. Why is there anything and not just nothing? Okay? Think about it. Why are we here? How did we get here? What was the purpose, if there were one, for us being here? And not just us, but I'm talking about the entire cosmos. If you really think about it, I tend to think answering that question, I think sure would go a long way in answering the question about the meaning of life. Because finding out how we got here would go a long way in finding out why we got here and what's the purpose, if there was any at all. It's a question of the meaning of life. Really, you could argue, is a question of teleology, of goals, of purposes. Okay, we exist. Okay, and though I know that some would actually try to argue against that, let's just go on the assumption, okay? We exist. We're here, you're here. You're listening to me, I'm listening. You couldn't be listening to me if you weren't here, okay? So we exist, okay? And this leads to the famous question, the opening line of Ludwig Wittgenstein's Tractatus. The world is all that is the case. Die Welt ist alles, was der Fall ist. The world is all the case. Okay? And by world, I would assume he meant the universe, the entire creation. And I think it's a fair question. Okay? Why are we here? Why is the universe here? And what are we doing in it now that we are here? Okay? However, and unfortunately, though he starts out here, he doesn't stay there. That is right off the bat, he kind of moves away from that. He comes to the foundation, and then he moves away from it, which, too bad, because again, I find that him as an atheist, he starts out by looking at the meaning of life, and he goes right to creation, and then he somehow drifts off from it, okay? However, he never really comes back to it either, and instead, for the rest of the book, I think the poor man is really just kind of chasing his Marxist tail around and around and around. In fact, there is a bit of dilly-dallying all the way through this book. He writes this, for instance. It is even conceivable, I love this, it is even conceivable that not knowing the meaning of life is part of the meaning of life. Let me read that again, okay? Because it is even conceivable that not knowing the meaning of life is part of the meaning of life, okay? Not knowing the meaning of life is part of the meaning of life. All right, I'm saying this 4 times already, or 3 times, because I'm trying to, he touches on this, and then wonderfully, he moves on because it's a little silly, though I suppose you could argue that not knowing the meaning of part of what not knowing the meaning of life is to know the meaning of life. It kind of points to some kind of transcendence. What is it that gave life the meaning to where part of the meaning is not knowing the meaning of life? I know that all sounds a little, but hey, I just work here, okay? Okay. I don't know. Something about that argument, it just doesn't work for me. Maybe there's something more subtle there, and yours truly, your host here is missing it, which probably wouldn't be the first time. In fact, later on, he gets realizing, giving his premises, that he's atheist, that finding a meaning to life is not that easy. He says this, I love this one, this makes the other one even a little bit less bizarre. Meanwhile, we can ask once again, what if the meaning of life were something that we should not at all costs, let me read it again. What if the meaning of life were something that we should at all costs not discover? Huh? is not saying that we can't discover it, but he's saying, what if the meaning of life were something that we should? It's almost as if the meaning is in not knowing what the meaning is, which, of course, then that's kind of one of these self-referential paradoxes. The meaning is that there is no meaning. Well, or we can't know the meaning. Well, then there is a meaning. I don't know. It's a little bizarre, if I ask me. Oh, he comes to this. And this maybe is a little more logical. On the very last section of the book he writes, in this sense, the meaning of life is interestingly close to meaninglessness. Okay? Again, if he said there is no meaning to life, but the meaning of life is close to meaninglessness, why doesn't he just say there is no meaning? I don't know. The bottom line is, with all due respect to Mr. Eagleton, these sentences are rather strange, and these thoughts are really, I think he's dilly-dallying. I think he just doesn't have an answer. Okay? I mean, if he said we cannot find the meaning of life, or it's hidden, or there is no meaning, that would only some degree make sense. But the meaning of life is interestingly close to meaninglessness? Interestingly close to meaninglessness? I don't know. Maybe I'm too simple of a guy, but I think Brother Eagleton here is doing an awful lot of obfuscating. Okay, now, perhaps one of the more interesting chapters in his book is chapter 2, and he touches on the question of death and what death does to the meaning of life. And in it, he starts out with these beautiful lines of Shakespeare. Man, I'm a writer. I wish I could have written like Shakespeare, but then I guess if I did that, I wouldn't be standing here in front of you. Okay, out, brief candle, life's but a shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. Man, that's good writing. Anyway, Eagleton uses this to touch on the question of the transience of life, the brevity of it, causing it to be ultimately meaningless. And this is the theme that I've touched on numerous times in this show, because ultimately I think it's right. You know, death does destroy the meaning. I mean, if all there is this spasm of cellular metabolism, this brief candle, this poor player who struts on the stage and then vanishes, well, he's right. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. However, he argues against that. And I've heard this argument before. And let's look at this for a moment. He says that yet the ephemerality of things is not necessarily tragic. It can be simply seen as part of the way that we are, with no inevitably doleful implication. If fine dinners fade away, so do tyrants and toothaches. Okay, but you know, tyrants and toothaches are not human lies. And when they fade away, we still exist. I'm talking about the eventual non-existence of all humanity, all life, all memories. Facing that kind of future doesn't, it seems to dedude life of meaning now. And then he writes, listen to this, I've heard this before, and this is interesting. I've had to dwell on this a little bit. Isn't death, in this sense, one of the preconditions for life having meaning at all? It's the idea that the inevitability of death is what gives life meaning now. We only have so much time, so let's make the best of it now. Let's do things now. Let's find meaning now, because poof, one day it's going to be gone. And though on the surface, there's a certain logic, though I think the longer you dwell on that thought, the idea that the inevitability of our dying, the fact that we know that we're only temporal, this can lead to meaning that I'm not so sure. If you really think about it again, it comes down to the fact that one day you're going to be gone. Anybody who ever knew you is going to be gone. Every memory of you is going to be gone. And so what does it all mean facing that? Anyway, if you have an answer, if you could find an answer to that, then please write to me at the Hope Channel and let me know what that answer is. Anyway, early on in the book, this is funny too. He does, even though, he's a Marxist, okay? So as a Marxist, he's got his view of the meaning of the world and why things happen the way they do and so on. And he really doesn't have much time for postmodernism. He really doesn't have much time for this. And he's got a line here, a couple lines here that... let me read it. Let me read it here. Pluralism has its limits in this sense too, that if there is such a thing as the meaning of life, it cannot be different for each of us. I say the meaning of my life is drinking as much whiskey as is compatible with just about being able to crawl. But I cannot say the meaning of life for me is drinking a lot of whiskey unless there is another way of making the former claim. It would be rather like saying the color of snow for me is turquoise tinged with magenta, or the meaning of Skittles is for me water lilies. In other words, he's making a point here he's basically arguing for some kind of totalizing of knowledge. And he'd have to, as a Marxist, it would be like somebody, basically, this is confusing here. But what he's saying is it's this pluralism, this postmodernism, it's like saying, well, maybe it's your truth that the sun brings heat and light to the earth, but it's not my truth. Okay? This is kind of silly. And anyway, he goes on talking about how these people try to make up the meaning of life for themselves. And let me use an analogy here, and I think I've used this years ago. I have a hairdryer. Let's just say it evolved. It came no purpose at all. A hairdryer evolved blindly, and it's a hairdryer, okay? So it doesn't really mean it's a hairdryer. I think it's a hairdryer. Okay, or somebody else thinks it's something else. So they use it for whatever they want. In other words, they make it mean whatever they want to mean. And he's saying that's what people do with life. They say it means whatever they want it to mean, and so on. But it's like, 2 plus 2 equals 4. Okay, even if everybody in the world thinks it's 5, it's really 4. So he's arguing against this idea that we make life mean whatever we want it to mean. He's saying, look, there's some overarching total thing here. And here's where the meaning comes from. But I agree. But he certainly seems to be having a hard time finding it. And then another place, he says this, it seems then that far from speaking of the meaning of life, we might be faced with the choice between meaning and life. Now, again, what in the world is this man talking about here? Okay, I'm not sure what that means. We're struck between meaning and life. Anyway, he even has a chapter called The Eclipse of Meaning. And he goes through all the nuances of the question. He spends an awful lot of time focusing on the question, what is the meaning of life? He's focusing on those 5, what is the meaning of life? Those 5, 6 words. But he never gets down to answering it. He never gets down to answering it. And he has a quote here. Not how the world is the mystical, but that is. Means perhaps that we can speak of this or that whole state of the affairs of the world, but not of the value or meaning of the world as a whole. Now that's kind of dumb too, and I'm not totally sure what it means. It's like, you could talk about the meaning of this chair, this table. This is a table, not a chair. Get with it, Cliff. Or I could talk about the meaning of the camera. Or I could talk about the meaning of my suspenders. Or I could talk about the meaning of America. Any one of these things might have meaning, but when you put the whole total together, it doesn't have meaning. I don't know. Doesn't make sense. But I go back to this quote that we just had. He was quoting Wittgenstein. Not how the world is the mystery, but that it is. And that goes back again to what he started on. He touched on this, Mr. Eagleton, Comrade Eagleton, but he never fleshed it out. And that's back to creation. If you want to know the meaning of life, it would seem logical to go back to the origins. How did it get here? Why did it get here? What purpose did it get here? If you argue it didn't get here for any purpose at all, fine. You could work from that. But it seems the most important answer, the most important place to go for the meaning of life would be to how life started, the origins. Of course, it's fascinating. The Word of God starts right there. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Scripture starts there and then builds everything from that, on that premise. That's where it goes. And from there, we could find the meaning of our lives as revealed in the Word of God. Anyway, he comes close to it. It was frustrating. I was actually kind of excited in this very short introduction to the meaning of life. He comes close, but he skirts it, and he winds up ultimately with nothing, no answer.